The words fell across the dinner table like a blade drawn in a cathedral. I would rather surrender the title and every last acre that answers to it than bind myself in marriage to a woman I have never laid eyes upon, on the strength of a dead man's sentimental whim. The dining room at Ashenmere Hall held its breath. Candlelight trembled in the silver candelabras as though even the flames had flinched. At the head of the long mahogany table sat Corwin Draith, 9th Duke of Ashenmere, his face set in the cold, immovable expression of a man who had spoken his final word on a matter and intended it to remain final. Across from him his aunt, Lady Morven, lowered her wineglass with a deliberate, dangerous calm. Beside her, Mr. Havelock, the family solicitor, clutched his napkin as if it were the last plank of a sinking vessel. "Your father gave his word, Corwin," Lady Morven said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the particular weight of a woman who had spent 6 decades refusing to be ignored. A promise was made to Emmerich Lydgate. A formal understanding between 2 honorable men. "My father made a great many promises," Corwin replied, his tawny brown eyes fixed on the dark wine in his glass. "He promised to restore the East tenancies. He promised to settle the debts on the northern coal rights. He promised to live long enough to see the estate through the worst of it. He failed in all of these. I am left to sort the wreckage, and I will not add a strange woman to the rubble." "Miss Lydgate is not rubble," Lady Morven said, her tone sharpening. "She is the daughter of a man your father loved like a brother. She is a name on a piece of paper. I have never met her. I do not know her character, her temperament, or her face. And I will not be bartered like livestock to honor a contract I did not sign." Mr. Havelock cleared his throat. "Your Grace, the understanding, while not legally binding, carries considerable moral and social obligation. The Lydgate family was of excellent standing. Miss Lydgate herself is said to be accomplished, well-educated, and of fine disposition. Then she will have no difficulty finding a husband who actually wants one," Corwin said. He set down his glass with a sound like a full stop and rose from his chair. "The matter is closed. I trust you will both respect that." He left the room. The door did not slam. It closed with a soft, precise click that was somehow worse, the sound of absolute authority requiring no exclamation. In the serving corridor just beyond the dining room, a young woman stood with a pitcher of water in her hands, her back pressed flat against the stone wall. She had heard every word. Her name, as far as anyone at Ashenmere knew, was Nell Pascoe. She was a junior housemaid, a small, composed figure, with dark hair pinned tightly beneath a plain cap and gray-green eyes that revealed nothing. She had been at Ashenmere Hall for 2 months, and in that time had made herself so quiet, so diligent, so utterly unremarkable that most of the household had already stopped noticing her. She stood perfectly still, the water pitcher steady in her grip, her face a mask of trained emptiness. Only her knuckles, white against the pewter handle, betrayed her. Because the woman the Duke had just refused to marry, the woman he had reduced to an abstraction, a stranger he would not be bartered for, was her. She set the pitcher down on the stone ledge with exacting care, smoothed the front of her apron, and walked back toward the kitchens. Her steps were measured. Her breathing was even. No one who passed her in the corridor would have seen anything but a servant going about her duties. But inside her chest something had cracked, a thin fracture line running through the last of her pride. She had survived worse. She reminded herself of that. She had survived the death of her father. She had survived the theft of her home, her name, her future. She had survived 2 years of poverty and invisibility. She could survive the contempt of a man who did not know he was speaking of the woman who filled his water glass. It was not the rejection that cut deepest, it was the word he had used. Sentimental. As though her father's friendship with the old Duke, a bond forged over decades of shared scholarship and mutual respect, was nothing more than foolish emotion. As though the promise made between 2 men who had trusted each other with their lives and their children was a whim to be brushed aside like dust from a mantelpiece. She reached the kitchen stairs and descended into the warm, clattering world below. The cook was arguing with a scullery maid about the state of the copper pans. A footman was polishing boots by the fire. No one looked up. She was invisible, and tonight, that invisibility was the only mercy she had. The following morning broke gray and damp, the autumn mist lying thick across the grounds of Ashenmere like a held breath. Nell was sent to carry linens to the upper floor, a task that took her past the long windows overlooking the stable yard. She paused, as she always did, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to see him. Vesper. He stood alone in the far paddock, separated from the other horses by a double fence, and a reputation that had become the stuff of kitchen whispers. He was a stallion of 17 hands, coal-black from muzzle to hoof, with a mane that hung like rough silk and eyes the color of dark amber. He had belonged to the old Duke, the Eight, and in the years before his death, he had been the pride of the Ashenmere stables. A magnificent, spirited creature who would take sugar from his master's palm and gallop at his command as though horse and rider shared a single mind. That was before. Since the old Duke's death 14 months ago, Vesper had become something else entirely. He had thrown 3 grooms. He had kicked through the door of his original stall with such force that the timber had to be replaced. He had bitten the head stableman badly enough to leave a scar across the man's forearm that would never fully fade. The head groom, Mr. Furr, Truan, a man who had handled horses for 30 years and feared nothing with 4 legs, had petitioned the new Duke twice to have the animal destroyed. Corwin had refused both times, but offered no explanation. The horse was moved to the far paddock, fed and watered at a distance, and left alone. He was a problem without a solution, too dangerous to approach, too significant to destroy. He paced the fence line day after day, his hooves wearing a bare track in the grass, and screamed into the wind at intervals that made the kitchen maids cross themselves. Everyone at Ashenmere feared Vesper. Everyone kept their distance. Everyone except Nell. It had begun 3 weeks after her arrival. She had been crossing the stable yard at dusk, carrying a basket of dried herbs for the still room, when she heard the low, troubled sound. Not the stallion's usual furious scream, but something quieter, a rasping rhythmic blowing, the sound of an animal in distress. She had gone to the fence without thinking, her body moving before her mind could caution her. The stallion was standing in the far corner of the paddock, his head hanging low, his breathing labored. One of his forelegs was swollen above the hoof, hot to the look of it, even from a distance. She should have walked away. She should have reported it to Mr. Trowan and let the groom deal with it. But she knew what she was seeing, and she knew that by the time the groom summoned the nerve to enter the paddock, the swelling would have worsened. She set the basket down. She climbed the fence. The stallion's head came up, his ears flat, his nostrils flaring. He was enormous at close quarters, a wall of muscle and barely contained fury. She stopped 5 paces from him and stood still. She did not speak. She did not reach out her hand. She simply breathed, slowly and steadily, letting the rhythm of her own calm fill the space between them. 1 minute. 2. The stallion's ears came forward by a fraction. His breathing steadied. He watched her with those dark amber eyes, and something in them shifted from fury to a wary, desperate curiosity. She took 1 step, then another. She reached him. She laid her hand on his neck, just below the jaw, and felt the violent tremor that ran through his body. Not rage, exhaustion, grief. She had knelt in the mud and examined his leg. It was a poultice matter, nothing more. She had returned that night with linen and a paste of comfrey and clay, and she had dressed the wound while the stallion stood over her, trembling, but still his muzzle resting against her shoulder. Since then, Vesper had watched for her. When she crossed the yard, his great head would turn, tracking her movement. When she passed the paddock fence, he would walk to meet her, pressing his nose against the rails. He never screamed when she was near. He simply stood, waiting, as though her presence was the only thing in this altered world that still made sense to him. The other servants noticed. Of course they called it unnatural. The cook said the girl must have an uncanny touch. Mr. Trian said nothing at all, but his face darkened each time he saw the stallion's head turn toward the slight figure in the gray dress. Only Nell understood what was truly happening. She recognized the animal's grief because she carried the same weight in her own chest. They were two creatures stripped of the lives they were meant for, surviving on stubbornness and the thinnest thread of remaining trust. But Nell, Pasco, and Vesper, the stallion, were not the whole truth. Her real name was Tamsin Lydgate, and she had come to Ashenmere Hall not for a servant's wages, but for proof that her life had been stolen. Her father, Emmerich Lydgate, had been a man of science and wide respect. A botanist, a naturalist, and a cartographer of rare precision, he had spent the final decade of his life mapping the estates and botanical specimens of the great northern houses. His work for the old Duke of Ashenmere had been his crowning achievement, a comprehensive survey of the estate's lands, boundaries, mineral rights, and natural resources, so detailed and so valuable that it had become the definitive legal record of the Ashenmere holdings. He had also been the old Duke's closest friend. The two men, so different in station and so alike in intellect, had spent long evenings in the Ashenmere library debating philosophy, examining star charts, and planning the future. It was during one of those evenings that the promise had been made, a quiet, private agreement between two fathers that their children, Corwin and Tamsin, might one day be joined in marriage, not a command, but a hope. Emmerich Lydgate had died 3 years ago, leaving his only daughter a comfortable inheritance. And a house in the village of Penford, a modest income, and his life's work of maps, surveys, and botanical illustrations, a collection so meticulous and so legally significant that it was worth a fortune to the right buyer. But Tamsin had never seen any of it. Within weeks of her father's death, a man named Aldous Gold, her father's former assistant and surveyor's apprentice, had produced a revised will. It left everything to him. The house, the income, the maps, the surveys, every scrap of paper Emmerich Lydgate had ever produced. Aldous Galt had moved swiftly. The original solicitor was replaced. The witnesses were men Tamsin had never seen. By the time she understood what was happening, she was standing outside her own front door with a single trunk and 11 pounds to her name. And the steward of Ashenmere Hall, the man who controlled the daily operations of the estate and managed its records and correspondence, was Mr. Caius Galt, Aldous Galt's elder brother. It was not coincidence. Tamsin had spent a year in destitution before the pieces fell into place. A letter from one of her father's old colleagues, a retired professor of natural history, had reached her at the boarding house where she was scrubbing floors to pay for a bed. The professor remembered Emmerich speaking of his most important work, the Ashenmere survey. He remembered something else as well. Emmerich had once mentioned in passing that he kept duplicate copies of his most critical documents at Ashenmere itself, stored in the estate's map room for safekeeping, with the full knowledge and permission of the old Duke. If those duplicates still existed, they would prove that Emmerich's body of work belonged to his daughter. They would expose the forged will. They would dismantle everything Aldous Galt had built on her father's stolen legacy. So Tamsin Lydgate had vanished, and Nell Pasco, a quiet, capable orphan girl with forged references and a talent for being overlooked, had taken a position as a junior housemaid at Ashenmere Hall. She had spent 2 months learning the house, the routines, the geography of power. She had identified the map room, a locked chamber adjacent to the steward's office on the ground floor. And she had waited for the moment to act. Last night, standing in the servants' corridor with a pitcher of water and the Duke's contempt ringing in her ears, she had learned that her time was shorter than she thought. If the Duke was determined to sever all connection with the Lydgate name, it would only be a matter of weeks before the steward, Caius Galt, moved to erase whatever traces of Emmerich Lydgate's work remained in the house. The maps, The surveys, the proof of her father's legacy and her own birthright. All of it could disappear into a fire or a locked cabinet, and no one would ever know. She had 4 days. She had overheard the solicitor mention it to Lady Morven as she cleared the dessert plates. 4 days until the legal window for contesting the Lydgate estate closed permanently. After that, the forged will would become unassailable. 4 days to find the proof, 4 days to reclaim her name, and the man whose help she needed most, the man whose house she crept through like a ghost, had just declared to the world that she meant nothing to him at all. The trouble with Vesper came to a head the following morning. Tamsin was on her knees in the boot room, blacking the household shoes with a methodical, mechanical rhythm, when she heard the commotion. Shouting from the stable yard, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, and beneath it all, the high, wild scream of a horse in fury, she set down the blacking brush. She did not run. Running would draw attention. She walked at a measured pace through the kitchen corridor, past the scullery, and out into the pale morning light. A small crowd had gathered at the edge of the stable yard. 2 grooms stood at a wary distance, their faces white. Mr. Trewin was pressed against the wall of the tack room, a broken lead rope in his hands and a fresh cut across his left cheek that was weeping red into his collar. And in the center of the yard, loose and trembling with rage, stood Vesper. The stallion's ears were flat, his coat was dark with sweat. His hooves struck the cobblestones in sharp, percussive bursts as he swung his great head from side to side, daring anyone to come closer. They had tried to move him. Tamsin could see the remains of a makeshift halter on the ground, the leather snapped clean through. Someone had decided to attempt what no one had managed in 14 months, to bring the stallion under control, and it had gone exactly as badly as she could have predicted. Mr. Trewin saw her standing at the edge of the yard. His eyes narrowed. The blood on his face made him look feral. "Get back inside, girl," he spat. "This is no place for a housemaid." She should have obeyed. Every calculation she had made over the past 2 months, every careful layer of invisibility she had built, demanded that she turn around and walk away. She was 4 days from the end of everything. She could not afford a single moment of exposure. But Vesper saw her. The stallion's head came up. His ears, which had been pinned flat in fury, swiveled forward. He stopped his restless stamping. His entire body oriented toward her, like a compass needle finding north. The change was immediate and unmistakable, and every person in the yard saw it. The cook's boy, watching from the kitchen doorway, whispered something to the girl beside him. Mr. Trewin's blood-streaked face went rigid with a mixture of disbelief and a barely concealed resentment. The 2 junior grooms exchanged a glance, and on the first floor above, standing at the window of his study with a ledger forgotten in his hand, Corwin Draith saw it too. Vesper took a step toward Nell, then another. His hooves, which had been hammering the stones with enough force to crack bone, fell as softly as if he were walking on deep grass. He crossed the yard in 6 strides and stopped in front of her. He lowered his enormous head until his muzzle was level with her chest. He blew a long, shuddering breath against her apron, and then he was still. The yard was silent. No one moved. Tamsin stood with her hands at her sides, every nerve in her body screaming at her to reach out, to lay her palm against the flat of his cheek, to offer the comfort that this broken, magnificent animal was asking for. She could feel the warmth of him, the living weight of his grief. She knew that a single touch would quiet him completely. She knew that she could lead him back to the paddock with nothing but her hand on his neck and her voice in his ear. But Mr. Trewin was watching, his eyes hard with wounded pride. The other servants were watching, their faces alive with the particular hunger that accompanies spectacle. And above them all, though she did not yet know it, the Duke was watching. She dared not be remarkable. She dared not be seen. "Stand aside, girl," Mr. Trewin said, his voice low and dangerous. He had picked up a riding crop from the ground. "I said, get back inside." Tamsin stepped backward. 1 step. 2. The stallion's head came up, his eyes widening, his nostrils flaring with the beginning of panic. He followed her, pressing forward, his muzzle seeking her shoulder. She stepped back again, and this time she turned her face away from him. It was the hardest thing she had done since arriving at Ashenmere. Harder than scrubbing flagstones until her hands cracked. Harder than carrying coal scuttles up 4 flights of stairs in the dark. Harder than standing in a corridor, listening to a man dismiss her father's love as sentiment. She turned away from an animal who trusted her, and she walked back through the kitchen door without looking behind her. She heard Vesper scream. A single piercing cry of abandonment that echoed off the stone walls of the yard and seemed to pass straight through her body. She heard the crack of the riding crop. She heard Mr. Trowan shouting commands. She kept walking. She returned to the boot room, knelt on the cold floor, picked up the blacking brush, and resumed her work. Her hands were shaking so badly that the black polish smeared across her knuckles and onto her cuffs. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury for people whose grief was witnessed and honored. Hers was not. She would carry it silently, as she carried everything else, folded tight and hidden beneath the uniform of a woman she was not. Upstairs, Corwin stood at the window long after the yard had emptied. The grooms had eventually managed to corner the stallion with ropes and drag him back to the paddock, a process that involved 3 men, considerable shouting, and a level of force that made Corwin's jaw tighten with distaste. But it was not the grooms who occupied his thoughts. It was the girl, Nell, the quiet one. He had seen the stallion go to her. He had seen the immediate, unmistakable transformation in the animal. And he had seen her walk away from it, not in fear. He had watched her face from above, and there had been no fear in it. There had been something far more difficult to dismiss. Control. Deliberate, agonizing control. She had chosen to abandon the animal rather than draw attention to herself. Why? A girl with that kind of gift for handling horses could name her own position in any stable in the county. It was a talent that grooms spent lifetimes trying to develop. She had it naturally, effortlessly, and she was actively hiding it. He returned to his desk but did not sit. He stood behind his chair, his fingers gripping the leather back, and stared at the estate map pinned to the wall without seeing it. The image of the stallion pressing his muzzle against the girl's apron would not leave his mind. Vesper had not gone to anyone since his father's death. Not to the grooms, not to Corwin himself. The horse seemed to regard the entire human race with the same bitter, grieving contempt, and Corwin had understood it because he felt much the same way. Yet with this girl, this silent, unremarkable housemaid, the stallion was gentle. He was almost tender, and she had walked away from him as though it cost her nothing. But Corwin had seen her hands. Even from the first-floor window he had seen the tremor. It had cost her everything. He thought of his father, Itziha. The old Duke had always said that the truest measure of a person's character was not what they did when they were being watched, but what they chose not to do. The girl had been watched by every person in that yard, and she had chosen to be invisible. She had chosen to suppress something extraordinary in herself in order to remain ordinary. It was the most remarkable act of discipline he had witnessed in years, and it unsettled him in a way he could not name. He rang the bell on his desk. A footman appeared within moments. "Send for Mr. Galt," Corwin said. "I want a word about the household staffing." The shift began that afternoon. Caius Galt was a man who occupied his position the way a spider occupies the center of its web. He was the steward of Ashenmere Hall, and he had held the role for close to a decade, first under the old Duke and now under Corwin. He was tall and narrow, with thinning fair hair combed precisely across a pale scalp, and a pair of round spectacles that he had a habit of adjusting whenever he wished to convey that the person speaking to him had said something slightly beneath his notice. His efficiency was beyond question. His knowledge of the estate's finances, tenancies, and legal affairs was encyclopedic. He had made himself indispensable, and he knew it. What Corwin did not know, what no one at Ashenmere knew, was that Caius Galt's position of trust was built on the same rotten foundation as his brother's stolen fortune. Aldous Galt had not acted alone when he forged Emmerich Lydgate's will. It was Caius who had arranged for the original solicitor to be replaced. It was Caius who had provided the witnesses from among his own network of associates. And it was Caius who had ensured that any documents at Ashenmere that might connect the old Duke to the Lydgate family were quietly removed, reclassified, or locked away in the map room, a chamber to which only he held the key. The brothers' scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Aldous had taken the Lydgate property and the income. Caius had taken the maps and surveys, the documents that proved the true extent of the Lydgate work and its legal connection to the Ashenmere estate. As long as both halves remained hidden, the theft was impenetrable. And as long as Caius controlled access to the map room, no one would ever stumble upon the truth. He had not recognized Tamsin. She had been a girl of 17 when he had last seen her, standing in the doorway of her father's study, while Caius and Aldous inventoried the contents. She had grown thinner, harder, her face stripped of the softness that youth and comfort provide. Her hair was darker. Her voice, which had once carried the clear, confident tones of an educated young woman, was now pitched low and careful, a servant's voice. She had remade herself completely. But Caius Galt was not a careless man. He had not survived nearly a decade in a position of trust by failing to notice details. And in the past week, 2 details had troubled him. The first was the girl's proximity to the map room. Her duties as a junior housemaid kept her on the upper floors, for the most part, but 3 times in the past fortnight he had seen her in the ground floor corridor near his office. Each time she had been carrying cleaning supplies, her face blank and purposeful, her presence entirely plausible. But 3 times was a pattern, and Caius Galt did not believe in patterns that were coincidental. The second detail was the stallion. The story of the horse's strange attachment to the new maid had reached him through the kitchen gossip, and he had dismissed it as servant's fancy. But Mr. Truan's report about the incident in the stable yard had included a detail that lodged in Caius Galt's mind like a splinter. The girl had calmed the animal instantly, not with force, not with food, but with her mere presence. It meant nothing in itself. Some people had an affinity for horses. But Emmerich Lydgate had possessed exactly the same gift. It had been one of his defining traits, the naturalist's instinct, the ability to communicate with animals through patience and stillness. Caius had watched Emmerich calm the old Duke's horses on more than one occasion, and the memory of it surfaced now with an unpleasant clarity. He could not afford to be wrong. He could not afford to be right, either. He began to watch the girl. He did it quietly, as he did all things through the existing systems of the house. He spoke to the housekeeper, Mrs. Thurlow, a decent but anxious woman who was eager to please the steward, and took his suggestions as though they were commandments. He mentioned that the new girl seemed to have a wandering tendency. He suggested that her duties be reassigned to keep her occupied and supervised at all times. Mrs. Thurlow, who had no particular opinion about Nell Pascoe one way or another, was happy to oblige. The next morning, Tamsin found her routine completely altered. She was removed from the upper floor rotation and assigned to the laundry, the most physically demanding and most isolated position in the household. The laundry occupied a low, damp building behind the kitchens, separated from the main house by a covered walkway and a heavy door that was locked at 9 each evening. The work was brutal. Sheets, tablecloths, shirts, and linens in an endless procession of boiling water, lye soap, heavy irons, and scalding steam. The hours were longer. The supervision was constant. A senior laundress named Bridie, a woman of few words and rigid expectations, watched over the work with the vigilance of a prison warder. Tamsin understood what had happened. She did not know if Caius Gault had ordered the change directly or if he had simply planted the seed with Mrs. Thurlow, but the result was the same. She was being moved away from the main house, away from the ground floor corridor, away from the map room, and away from Vesper. She saw the stallion only at a distance now, a dark shape pacing the far paddock as she crossed the yard between the laundry and the kitchens. He would stop when he saw her, his head high, his ears forward, watching her with those deep, watchful eyes that seemed to hold a question she could not answer. She never paused. She never looked at him for more than a heartbeat, but each time she felt the pull, the deep, wordless recognition between two beings who understood each other's loss. The isolation extended beyond the physical. In the servants' hall, the whispers had taken on a sharper edge. The story of the incident in the stable yard had been retold and embellished until it bore little resemblance to the truth. In one version, the girl had bewitched the horse with a charm. In another, she had been caught trying to ride him. Mr. Trewin, humiliated by the stallion's obvious preference for a housemaid over his own professional handling, had let it be known that he considered the girl a nuisance and a troublemaker. The other servants, following the current of power as servants always do, had adjusted their behavior accordingly. Nell Pascoe was no longer simply the quiet new girl. She was the odd one, the one who courted trouble and attracted the wrong kind of attention. Tamsin ate her meals at the end of the long table, her plate before her, her eyes down. She answered questions in monosyllables. She volunteered nothing. She retreated to her narrow room each evening and lay on the hard bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours she had left. 3 days. The solicitor had said 4 days. 1 was already gone. In 3 days, the legal window would close, and Aldous Gault's forged will would become permanent, uncontestable, absolute. Her father's life's work, his maps, his surveys, his legacy, all of it would belong to the man who had stolen it, and Tamsin Lydgate would cease to exist in any way that mattered. She had to get into the map room, but the map room was on the ground floor, adjacent to the steward's office, and she was now confined to the laundry from dawn till well past dark. Caius Gault had sealed her office surely as if he had bricked up a doorway. Worse still, she sensed that his interest in her was not yet satisfied. Twice she had caught him watching her from across the stable yard, his spectacles catching the gray light, his expression one of cool, methodical assessment. He was not certain of anything yet. She could see that in the careful distance he maintained, the way he studied her without confrontation. He was gathering evidence, building a case, waiting for her to make a mistake. A single mistake would end her. But neither could she afford to wait. The two imperatives were a vice, tightening with every passing hour. On the second morning after the stable yard incident, a visitor arrived at Ashenmere Hall. The carriage was elegant, but not ostentatious, drawn by a pair of matched gray horses and bearing no crest on its door. It pulled up to the front entrance just after 10, and a woman stepped down with the deliberate grace of someone who had been stepping out of carriages for 70 years and saw no reason to alter her technique. Lady Morvendraith was the old Duke's younger sister, Corwin's aunt by blood, and the one person in the family whose authority he could not simply override with a cold look and a closed door. She had written ahead to announce her arrival, but Corwin had been too absorbed in the estate ledgers and his own dark thoughts to prepare for the reality of her presence. Lady Morven did not visit Ashenmere for the scenery. She came when she had something to say, and she said it with a directness that most people found either refreshing or terrifying, depending on which side of it they stood. She had been at the dinner 2 nights ago when Corwin had made his declaration. She had said nothing at the time, a silence that Corwin should have recognized as dangerous. Lady Morven's silences were never empty. They were strategic. She found Corwin in the library, a long, handsome room on the ground floor with tall windows overlooking the gardens and shelves that climbed to a ceiling painted with a faded mural of classical figures. He was standing at his desk, a letter in his hand, his face set in the particular expression of a man who has received bad news and is deciding how much of it to acknowledge. Aunt Morven. He inclined his head. I trust the journey was comfortable. The journey was abominable, she said, settling herself into the chair nearest the fire, without waiting to be invited. The roads are a disgrace, and your coachman drives as though he is being pursued by wolves. But I did not come to discuss the roads. She fixed him with a gaze that had lost none of its sharpness despite the creases around her eyes. I came to discuss what you said at dinner. The matter is closed. The matter is a disaster, and you are the one who made it so. Corwin set the letter down on his desk. Aunt, I have considerable respect for your judgment, but my marriage, or the absence of one, is not a subject on which I require guidance. You require guidance on a great many things, Corwin, not least of which is the distinction between pride and stupidity. She held up a hand before he could respond. Your father made a promise to Emmerich Lydgate. That promise was made in good faith, between two men of honor. For the benefit of their children, you have dismissed it as sentiment. Do you know what that word truly means? I know what it means. It means feeling. It means the capacity to care about something beyond one's own comfort and convenience. Your father had it. Your mother had it. God rest her. Even that wild stallion out there has it, grieving as he is for the man who loved him. You seem to have excised it from yourself like a surgeon removing a tumor. She paused, her sharp eyes studying his face. When did you become so frightened of feeling, Corwin? He did not answer. He stood at the desk with his hands flat on the surface, his jaw set, his tawny eyes fixed on a point beyond her shoulder. She watched the stillness in him and recognized it for what it was, not strength. Armor, the kind a man builds when the alternative is to acknowledge that he is in pain. You lost your father, she said, her voice softening by a degree. You inherited a title you were not ready for, debts you did not create, and a house full of ghosts. I understand why you have locked yourself away behind rules and ledgers and cold logic. But Corwin, you are becoming your own prison, and you are punishing people who have done nothing to deserve it. I have punished no one. You have punished a woman you have never met. Miss Lydgate, wherever she is, has just been told by the Duke of Ashenmere that her father's dearest wish for her future is worthless. That she is nothing to you. That she is a stranger not worth the trouble of meeting. Lady Morven shook her head slowly. Emmerich Lydgate loved that girl more than anything on this earth. He spoke of her to your father with such pride and tenderness that it would have moved a stone. And your father, who was not a sentimental man despite your characterization, was moved. He gave his word. Not lightly, not on a whim, because he believed that his son and Lydgate's daughter might make each other better. Corwin's fingers pressed harder against the desk. You are asking me to marry a woman I have never met, on the basis of a dead man's belief. I am asking you to consider that you might be wrong. She rose from her chair. I am asking you to consider that your certainty is not wisdom. It is fear. And I am asking you to look around this house, at the stallion you cannot bring yourself to destroy, at the servants who walk past you as though you were made of ice, and at that quiet girl in the laundry who seems to be the only living creature capable of reaching the heart of that wretched horse. And ask yourself whether perhaps you have lost the ability to see what is right in front of you. Corwin's head came up. What girl? Lady Morven raised an eyebrow. You do not know. The entire household is talking about it. One of the housemaids, a young woman called Nell, has some extraordinary connection with your father's stallion. The animal, who has terrorized every groom in the county, apparently becomes as gentle as a lamb in her presence. And for her trouble, she has been banished to the laundry by her steward, and made a pariah by the staff. She gathered her gloves from the chair. Your father would have wanted to know why. He would have been curious. He would have asked questions. He would have seen the girl, Corwin, not the uniform, not the station, the person. She walked to the door. You are your father's son. I have to believe that the man he raised is still in there, somewhere underneath all that granite. She left the room. The door clicked shut behind her. Corwin stood motionless at his desk. His aunt's words hung in the air like smoke after a fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. He walked to the window and looked out across the gardens toward the stable yard. From here, he could see the far paddock, the dark shape of the stallion pacing the fence line, and beyond it, the low roof of the laundry building, where a wisp of steam rose from the chimney into the gray sky. The girl was in there. The girl who had calmed his father's horse with nothing but her presence, and then walked away from the animal as though her own heart were not breaking. He had told himself it was not his concern. He had told himself that the affairs of servants were the steward's domain, and that Caius Galt's management of the household was not something he needed to question. But his aunt's words had landed on a bruise he had not known was there. "You are punishing people who have done nothing to deserve it." He thought of the stallion's scream as the girl walked away. He thought of the crack of Mr. Truan's riding crop. He thought of the quiet figure kneeling in the boot room, her hands shaking, her face composed. And for the first time in 14 months, the Duke of Ashenmere felt the cold, uncomfortable stirring of something he had spent a great deal of effort trying to bury. Doubt. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tamsin's opportunity came on the second night. It was not a plan so much as an act of desperation, given shake by timing. The household retired early on account of a heavy rainstorm that had rolled in from the moors, turning the grounds to mud and filling the corridors with a damp, penetrating cold. The laundry had been shut down early because the drying lines were useless in the downpour, and Bridie, the senior laundress, had dismissed the girls with a grunt and a warning to be in their beds by 9. Tamsin lay in her narrow room on the upper floor, fully dressed beneath the thin blanket, listening to the rain hammer against the window. She counted the sounds of the house settling into sleep. Reached in. The creak of floorboards as the other maids moved to their rooms, the distant clatter of the kitchen being closed for the night, the low murmur of the footman in the servants' hall, fading to silence as the fire burned down. By 11, the house was still. She had 2 days left. After tomorrow, the legal window would close. There would be no more chances. She rose from the bed, wrapped a dark shawl around her shoulders, and took the single candle from the shelf above the basin. She did not light it. The corridors were too exposed. She would navigate by memory and by the faint gray light that filtered through the windows from the storm-washed sky. She eased open her door and stepped into the hallway. The floorboards were cold beneath her thin slippers. She moved with the practiced silence of someone who had spent 2 months memorizing every creak, every loose board, every hinge that protested. She reached the narrow service stairs and began to descend, her hand trailing along the rough plaster wall to guide her. The ground floor was darker than the upper stories. The windows here were smaller, set deeper into the thick stone walls, and the rain had reduced the outside world to a featureless gray wash. She paused at the bottom of the stairs and listened. Nothing. The service corridor stretched ahead of her, a tunnel of shadow leading toward the main house. The map room was at the far end of the ground floor corridor, past the steward's office, past the estate office, past the small sitting room that Caius Galt used for private meetings. She had walked this corridor a dozen times during her first weeks at Ashenmere, memorizing the doors, counting the paces. She knew that the map room door was the last on the left, set in a shallow alcove. She knew it was locked. She had spent the past week thinking about that lock. It was old, heavy, a brass mechanism set into an oak door that had been there since the house was built. It was the kind of lock that responded to a specific type of key, long-shanked. With a double ward, she did not have the key. Caius Galt carried it on a chain attached to his waistcoat, and a duplicate hung on the housekeeper's ring, though Mrs. Thurlow had confided to the cook that the steward had asked her never to use it without his express permission. But Tamsin's father had taught her something about old houses and old locks. He had been a surveyor of estates for 20 years, and he had encountered every variety of door, panel, and hidden chamber that the great houses of England had to offer. "The lock on the door is the one they want you to see," he had told her once, his eyes bright with the quiet delight of a man who loved puzzles. "It is the one they show to visitors. But old houses breathe, Tamsin. They shift and settle over centuries. The walls are never quite where the plans say they should be. Always look for the gaps." She was looking for a gap. She reached the ground floor corridor and pressed herself against the wall, her breathing shallow. The corridor was empty. The doors on either side were closed. She moved forward, counting her steps. 12 paces to the estate office. 18 to Galt's sitting room. 24 to the map room alcove. She reached the alcove and felt for the door in the darkness. Her fingers found the cold brass of the lock, the solid oak of the frame. She ran her hands along the wall to the right of the door, then to the left. Stone. Plaster. A narrow wooden molding that ran along the base of the wall at ankle height. She crouched down and traced the molding with her fingertips. There, a section that was fractionally looser than the rest. She pressed it, and it gave by half an inch, revealing a narrow gap between the molding and the wall. Not a door. A vent. An old air passage, the kind that had been built into houses of this age to prevent damp from settling in enclosed rooms. It was barely 8 inches wide, running horizontally along the base of the wall, far too small to crawl through. But it told her something. It told her that the wall between the corridor and the map room was not solid stone. It was lath and plaster over a timber frame, a later addition, a partition wall built to divide what had once been a single larger room. And partition walls, unlike stone walls, could be breached. She needed to get to the other side. She needed to find the adjoining room and determine whether there was a way through. She straightened up and moved to the next door along the corridor. It was unlocked. She turned the handle and stepped inside. It was the old butler's pantry, a small disused room that smelled of dust and cold metal. It had not been in regular service for years. She closed the door behind her and finally lit her candle. The flame jumped and steadied, throwing long shadows across bare shelves and a stone floor stained with the ghosts of old spills. The wall that separated this room from the map room was directly in front of her. She held the candle close and examined the surface. Plaster old and cracked with a pattern of fine lines that mapped the timber frame beneath. She pressed her palm against it at intervals, feeling for the telltale hollow sound that would indicate an unsupported span. Near the floor, in the corner furthest from the door, she found it. A section of plaster, roughly 2 feet square, that sounded different from the rest. Thinner, drier. She pressed harder and felt the surface flex beneath her hand. She could break through here. It would take time and it would make noise, but the rainstorm would cover the sound. She set the candle on the floor, took off her shawl, and wrapped it around her fist. She had raised her hand to strike when she heard the footstep. It came from the corridor. A single deliberate tread on the stone floor followed by silence. Not a servant's step. Servants in this house wore soft-soled shoes that whispered on the flagstones. This was the sound of a leather sole, a gentleman's boot. Tamsin blew out the candle. The darkness swallowed her. She pressed herself into the corner behind the door, her wrapped fist still raised, her heart slamming against her ribs. She held her breath and listened. Another step, closer now. Then the faint, measured creak of a floorboard in the corridor directly outside the pantry door. Whoever it was had stopped. They were standing on the other side of the door, separated from her by 2 inches of oak. The handle turned, the door swung inward slowly, and a shaft of pale lamplight fell across the stone floor. Tamsin shrank further into the corner, making herself as small as possible. The lamp entered first, held at chest height, its glow illuminating the room in sections. The shelves, the stained floor, the corner where she crouched. The light found her. She squeezed her eyes shut against the glare, and heard a sharp intake of breath that was not her own. "Stand up." The voice was quiet, controlled and unmistakable. The Duke. She rose. Her legs were trembling, but she locked her knees and forced herself to stand straight. She let the shawl fall from her fist and clasped her hands in front of her, the posture of a servant awaiting judgment. Corndraith stood in the doorway, a lamp in one hand and the other resting on the doorframe. He was in shirt sleeves, his collar open, his dark hair disordered, as though he had been running his hands through it. He had not been to bed. His tawny eyes, sharp and unreadable in the lamplight, moved from her face to her hands, to the shawl on the floor, to the wall behind her. She watched him register the cracked plaster, the corner where she had been working, the proximity to the map room. He did not speak immediately. He stepped into the room and set the lamp on one of the bare shelves. The light steadied and filled the small space, throwing their shadows against the walls in stark relief. "You are not looking for a horse blanket," he said. It was not a question. "No, Your Grace. You are trying to get into the map room." She said nothing. There was nothing she could say that would not condemn her. A housemaid found in a disused pantry at midnight, attempting to break through a wall into a locked chamber. The conclusion was obvious, and it was damning. He studied her face. She met his gaze, though it cost her every remaining shred of composure. His expression was not what she had expected. There was no anger in it. There was no contempt. There was something far more dangerous. There was interest. "When I found you in the corridor last week," he said slowly, "I assumed you had taken a wrong turning. The week before that, I saw you near the estate office and thought the same. I did not think much of it. Servants wander. But tonight I could not sleep, and I heard a sound in the corridor that did not belong there, and I followed it, and I find you here." He gestured at the wall. "Attempting to breach the wall of a room that contains the legal records of this estate." He took a step closer. "A thief would go to the silver cabinet. A thief would go to my study, where the household accounts are kept. A thief would not be found in a disused pantry, examining the structural composition of a partition wall." His voice dropped. "What is in that room that you want?" The truth rose in her throat like a wave. She swallowed it back. She could not trust him. He was the Duke of Ashenmere, the master of this house, and his steward was the man who had orchestrated the theft of her life. If she spoke, Caius Galt would know within hours. The maps would be destroyed. The evidence would vanish, and she would be left with nothing. "I cannot say, Your Grace." His mouth tightened. "Cannot or will not. Both." The silence between them was absolute. The rain hammered against the small window, filling the room with a sound like distant applause. She could feel him weighing her, measuring her, his analytical mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle she represented. She was terrified, but she would not look away. She had learned that much from Vesper. "Stand still. Breathe. Do not flinch." "You are not a thief," he said at last. It was a statement, flat and certain as though he had arrived at a conclusion through some internal process of deduction and was now simply reporting the result. "No, Your Grace. Then you are something else. Something you do not wish me to know." He picked up the lamp. "Come with me." He did not wait for her to agree. He turned and walked out of the pantry, the lamp swinging a slow arc of light down the corridor. She had no choice but to follow. He led her not to the servants' hall, not to the housekeeper's office where a dismissed servant would be taken, but to the library. The room was dark, except for the low glow of embers in the wide stone fireplace. He set the lamp on the mantelpiece and turned to face her. The library was vast, 2 stories of books in shadow, and she felt the full weight of its authority pressing down on her. This was the heart of the house. This was where the Duke dispensed judgment. "I am going to ask you a question," he said, "and I want you to answer it truthfully. If you lie to me, I will know. If you refuse to answer, I will respect that, but I will draw my own conclusions." She nodded. "Are you here because of Emmerich Lydgate?" The name struck her like a physical blow. She flinched, a visible involuntary contraction of her entire body, and she saw him see it. She saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the sharpening of his attention. "How do you know that name?" she whispered. "He was my father's closest friend," Corwin said. "His work is the foundation of every legal document this estate possesses. His maps are in the room you were trying to reach. And his daughter, a young woman named Tamsin, has been missing for 2 years." He paused. "You have her eyes." The room tilted. The bookshelves, the fireplace, the tall, dark figure of the Duke, all of it swam in her vision as the walls she had built around herself cracked from foundation to roof. He knew, or he suspected enough, that the difference was meaningless. She could deny it. She could maintain the lie. Walk out of this room, pack her single trunk, and disappear into the night. She had done it before. She could do it again. But she was so tired. 2 years of hiding, 2 months of silence. 4 days of watching her last hope shrink to nothing. She was so unspeakably tired of carrying the weight of her stolen life alone. "My name is Tamsin Lydgate," she said. Her voice did not break, but it was very close. "Emmerich Lydgate was my father, and the proof that my inheritance was stolen from me is in your map room, behind a door to which your steward holds the only key." She told him everything. She stood in the firelight and spoke for 20 minutes without stopping, her voice steady, her eyes dry, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that the knuckles were bone white. She told him about her father's death, about Aldous Galt's forged will, about the stolen maps and surveys and the house in Penford that had been taken from her. She told him about the year of destitution, the boarding houses, the professor's letter, the connection to Caius Galt. She told him why she had come to Ashenmere, what she was looking for, and why she had only 2 days left to find it. He listened without interrupting. He did not sit down. He stood by the fireplace with one hand resting on the mantelpiece, his face half in shadow, his expression shifting by degrees from suspicion to comprehension, to something colder and harder than either. When she finished, the silence in the room was the silence of a held breath. "Galt," he said. The single word contained a fury so tightly controlled it was almost imperceptible, but she heard it, a hairline fracture in the granite. "Both brothers," she said. "Caius arranged the forgery. Aldous executed it. They divided the proceeds between them. Your steward has been living under your roof for 9 years on the strength of my father's stolen work." Corwin turned away from her and stared into the dying fire. She watched the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his spine, and she understood that she had just detonated something in the foundations of his world. His steward, the man he relied upon to manage the estate, the man who held the keys and the records and the institutional memory of Ashenmere, was a thief and a forger. "The map room?" he said without turning around. "You believe the duplicate documents are still there. My father kept copies of everything. It was his habit, his principle. If Caius Galt has not destroyed them, they will prove that the body of work Aldous claimed as his own was, in fact, my father's. They will prove the will was forged, and the legal deadline, 2 days. After that, the probate becomes final, and the forged will cannot be contested." He turned back to her. His face had changed. The cold composure was still there, the mask he wore against the world, but behind it she could see something moving. Not pity. Pity would have diminished her, and he seemed to understand that, instinctively. It was recognition, one person seeing another clearly for the first time, and understanding with a jolt the full scale of what they had endured. "You will go back to your room," he said. "You will tell no one what has passed between us. Tomorrow I will deal with Galt. The map room will be opened, and if what you say is there, it will be found. Your Grace, I must be the one to—" "You must be nowhere near it," he said, and for the first time his voice carried a note of urgency that cut through his usual measured tone. "If Galt sees you near that room, if he suspects for one moment what you are, Those documents will be ash before sunrise. You have survived 2 years by being invisible. I am asking you to be invisible for 1 more day." She wanted to argue. Every fiber of her being strained against the idea of placing her fate in someone else's hands, of trusting a man who 2 nights ago had dismissed her father's legacy as sentiment. But she looked at his face in the firelight and saw something she had not seen in anyone for a very long time. She saw a man who meant what he said. "I will trust you, Your Grace," she said quietly. "But you should know that I have no reason to trust anyone in this house." "You trust the horse," he said. She blinked. It was so unexpected, so outside the frame of the conversation, that for a moment she could not respond. "Vesper does not lie," she said. The faintest ghost of something that was not quite a smile passed across his face. "No," he said, "he does not, and I am beginning to understand his judgment." He opened the library door for her, a gesture so natural and so instinctive that neither of them remarked upon it. But it was the first time in her life at Ashenmere that a door had been opened for her rather than by her, and the significance of it settled in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She walked back through the dark house alone. She wished Vesper were beside her, the great black stallion grieving and raging and gentle only with her. He would have walked at her shoulder, his warm breath against her arm, a steady presence in the darkness. She climbed the stairs to the upper floor, entered her room, and sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness. She had given him the truth. All of it. Every secret, every wound, every desperate calculation. She had handed a stranger the power to save her or to destroy her, and she had done it because a horse trusted him enough to stand still in his paddock when he passed, and because she had seen in his eyes the same grief she carried in her own chest, and because she was too exhausted to carry it alone for 1 more hour. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the rain and waited for the morning to bring either salvation or ruin. Corwin did not sleep either. After Tamsin left the library, he locked the door, sat down at his desk, and began to work with the cold, precise focus of a man dismantling a bomb. He wrote 3 letters. The first was to his solicitor in the county town, instructing him to attend Ashenmere the following morning on a matter of extreme urgency, and to bring with him any records pertaining to the Lydgate estate and the probate of Emmerich Lydgate's will. The second was to the local magistrate, a man he knew personally, requesting a meeting at the earliest convenience regarding a matter of fraud. The third was to his aunt, Lady Morven, who was staying in the guest wing. It contained a single line: "You were right about everything. Come to the library at 10 tomorrow." He sealed the letters, set them aside, and then sat for a long time in the silence of the library thinking. He thought about the girl, about the steadiness of her voice as she laid her life bare before him, about the way her hands had been clasped so tightly he could see the tendons standing out beneath the reddened skin, about her eyes in the firelight, gray-green and fierce and exhausted and proud. He thought about Vesper, about the stallion's immediate absolute trust in her, about the way the animal, who had spent 14 months rejecting every human hand extended to him, had lowered his great head and pressed his nose against her shoulder as though she were the last safe place in the world. He's a fine judge of character, his father had always said of the horse loves honest souls, can't abide a fraud. And he thought about what he had said at dinner 2 nights ago, the words that had started all of this. "I would rather surrender the title than bind myself in marriage to a woman I have never laid eyes upon." He had laid eyes upon her now. He had looked at her and seen not a stranger to be dismissed, not a dead man's sentimental wish, but a woman of extraordinary courage who had walked into the house of her enemy and scrubbed its floors and borne its contempt and asked for nothing but the chance to reclaim what was rightfully hers. He had been wrong. He had been spectacularly, unforgivably wrong. And the knowledge of it sat in his chest like a coal, burning slowly and without mercy. The morning came gray and cold. Corwin was dressed and in the library by 7. At 8, he summoned Caius Galt to his study. The steward arrived promptly, as always. His spectacles polished, his ledger tucked under his arm, his face wearing the expression of mild, professional attentiveness that he had perfected over the better part of a decade. "Gaunt?" Corwin said. He was standing behind his desk, his hands clasped behind his back. "I need access to the map room." A flicker. The smallest possible contraction of the muscles around the steward's eyes, gone so quickly that most people would have missed it entirely. But Corwin was watching for it, and he saw it. "Of course, Your Grace. May I ask what you require?" "I can retrieve any document you need. I require the room itself. I intend to conduct a personal audit of the estate's cartographic records. My solicitor is arriving this morning, and I want the maps available for his inspection." Another flicker. Longer this time. A recalculation happening behind the polished lenses. "Your Grace, the map room is in some disarray at present. I have been meaning to reorganize the collection, but the press of other duties. The key." Galt. The words landed like stones. Corwin held out his hand, palm up, his eyes fixed on the steward's face. He watched the man's composure waver, crack, and then reassemble itself with the desperate speed of someone who knows that hesitation is confession. Caius Galt reached into his waistcoat pocket, removed the key from its chain, and placed it in the Duke's hand. His fingers were steady, but his face had lost a shade of color that it would not regain. "Will that be all, Your Grace?" "For the moment, stay in the house. I may have further questions." The steward bowed and left the room. Corwin watched him go and then turned the key over in his palm. It was heavy, old brass, warm from the man's body. Such a small thing to hold a life's work behind. He did not go to the map room immediately. He waited. He wanted witnesses. At 9:30, his solicitor arrived. Not Mr. Senninga, Havelock, the family's general counsel, but a man Corwin had sought out specifically. Mr. Pendray was a specialist in property and probate law, a brisk, competent man with a reputation for dismantling fraudulent claims. At 10, Lady Morven entered the library, having received his note. She took one look at her nephew's face and sat down without a word. At 10:15, Corwin sent a footman to find Nell Pascoe. The footman found Tamsin in the laundry, elbow deep in scalding water. Her hair escaping from her cap in damp tendrils. His face was uncertain, almost apologetic. "The Duke requires you in the library, miss." Bridie, the senior laundress, looked up from her ironing with an expression of pure suspicion. "What does the Duke want with a laundry maid?" "I was not told, ma'am, only that she is to come immediately." Tamsin dried her hands on her apron. She untied the apron, folded it neatly, and set it on the work table. She did not run. She walked with the same measured pace she had maintained for 2 months, through the covered walkway, across the stable yard, and into the main house. As she crossed the yard, Vesper raised his head above the paddock fence and watched her. He did not call out. He simply watched, his dark amber eyes steady, as though he knew that something was about to change and was waiting to see what shape it would take. The library door was open. She stepped inside and stopped. Corwin stood at the center of the room. Beside him was an older man she did not recognize, holding a leather case. In the chair by the fire sat Lady Morven, her face grave and watchful. And on the Duke's desk, spread across the mahogany surface like the pages of a dismantled book, were maps, dozens of them. Hand-drawn, meticulously labeled, rendered in the precise, elegant style that she would have recognized from across a crowded room because she had watched those hands draw them 1,000 times. Her father's maps. She made a sound. It was not a word, it was not a cry, it was a small, involuntary exhalation, as though something that had been wound unbearably tight inside her chest had suddenly released. She pressed her hand to her mouth and stared at the desk. "Come here," Corwin said. His voice was quiet. Not a command this time, an invitation. She crossed the room on legs that felt as though they belonged to someone else. She stopped at the desk and looked down at the maps. Her father's handwriting, his careful notations, his measurements, his botanical sketches in the margins, his initials in the bottom right corner of every sheet. E.L. Emmerich Lydgate. Here. Real. Not lost. Not destroyed. Saved, by accident or providence, behind a locked door in a house full of lies. She touched the edge of the nearest map with her fingertip. It was the survey of the north boundary. The one he had been working on the summer she turned 15. She remembered him at his desk, the ink on his fingers, the reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the way he would hum under his breath when the work was going well. "There is more," Corwin said. He reached into a leather portfolio on the desk and withdrew a sheaf of papers. "Letters from your father to mine, a contract of commission for the survey work, naming Emmerich Lydgate as sole author and proprietor of the resulting documents. And a copy of your father's original will, the real one, witnessed by my father and his solicitor. Leaving his entire estate to his daughter, he held the papers out to her. She took them. Her hands were shaking so badly that the pages rattled like dry leaves. Mr. Pendray," Corwin said, turning to the solicitor, "you have examined the documents. I have, your grace." The solicitor's voice was crisp and professional, but his eyes were kind. "The contract of commission is clear and unambiguous. The original will is properly witnessed and predates the probate document by 3 years. In my professional opinion, Miss Lydgate has more than sufficient grounds to overturn the contested probate and reclaim her father's estate in its entirety. Within the deadline, with a day to spare, your grace. I can file the application with the county court this afternoon." Tamsin looked up from the papers. Her vision was blurred. She blinked, and the tears she had held back for 2 years, 3 years, a lifetime, spilled down her cheeks in silence. She did not wipe them away. She did not try to stop them. She stood in the library of Ashenmere Hall, with her father's map spread before her, and her father's will in her hands, and she let herself cry for the first time since the day they told her he was gone. Lady Morven rose from her chair and came to stand beside her. She placed one hand on Tamsin's shoulder and said nothing. Sometimes silence was the greatest kindness. Corwin watched her cry. He did not look away. He did not offer platitudes or false comfort. He stood with his hands at his sides and bore witness to her grief and her relief and the terrible, beautiful collision of the two. And in doing so, he gave her something no one had given her in 3 years. He gave her the dignity of being seen. A door opened behind them. Tamsin turned. Caius Galt stood in the doorway. He had come because he could not stay away. The map room key was gone, the solicitor had arrived. Something was happening in the library, and every instinct of self-preservation told him he needed to know what it was. He stepped inside, and his gaze fell on the desk, on the maps, on the letters on the will. Then his gaze moved to Tamsin. For one long, terrible moment their eyes met, and she saw the instant he recognized her. The color did not drain from his face. It collapsed as though the bones beneath the skin had given way. His mouth opened. His spectacles caught the light and flashed like warning signals. "Your Grace," he began, his voice climbing toward a register it had never reached before. "I can explain. Those documents are incomplete. They were left in error. The map room has not been properly catalogued, and any conclusions drawn from." "Mr. Galt," Corwin's voice cut through the steward's rising panic like a blade through smoke. "You will stop speaking." Galt stopped. Corwin walked toward him. He did not hurry. He moved with the measured, deliberate tread of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. He stopped 2 paces from the steward and looked down at him. "You entered my father's service 9 years ago," Corwin said. "You came with excellent references and a reputation for meticulous record-keeping. My father trusted you. I trusted you. You were given the keys to this estate's most important records, and you used that trust to conceal a crime. Your Grace, I assure you, your brother, Aldous Galt, forged the will of Emmerich Lydgate. He stole the man's property, his income, and his life's work. You arranged the forgery. You provided the false witnesses. You ensured that the evidence my father had been entrusted with was locked away where no one could find it. And when Miss Lydgate came to this house in search of the truth, you saw to it that she was removed from any position where she might discover it." He paused. The silence was absolute. Lady Morven sat perfectly still by the fire. The solicitor held his pen motionless above his notebook. Tamsin stood at the desk, her father's papers in her hands, and watched the man who had stolen her life receive judgment. "You will leave this house within the hour," Corwin said. "You will take nothing but your personal belongings. Your brother will be served with papers by the end of the week. The magistrate has been notified. If you are wise, you will not attempt to contact Miss Lydgate or any member of this household ever again." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Authority, when it is absolute and righteous, requires no volume. Caius Gault stood in the doorway for 3 more seconds. His spectacles had slid down his nose, and he did not push them back. His hands hung at his sides, empty. 9 years of careful construction, of meticulous deceit, of stolen keys and hidden maps and quiet manipulation, all of it reduced to rubble in the space of 5 minutes. He turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing fainter, and then they were gone. Corwin turned back to Tamsin. She was watching him with an expression he could not decipher. Her tears had stopped, but her face was still wet, her eyes luminous in the gray light from the window. "Thank you," she said. The words were inadequate. She knew that. He knew that. But they were all she had. He shook his head. "Do not thank me. This house owed you a debt. My father owed you a debt. Those documents should have been delivered to you 3 years ago, and they were not, because I was too absorbed in my own grief to know what was happening under my own roof." He looked at her with an intensity that seemed to compress the air between them. "I said at that dinner table that I would rather lose my title than marry a woman I had never seen. I was speaking of a stranger. I was not speaking of you." The words landed in the space between them and stayed there. Not quite a declaration, not quite a question, but something that contained the shape of both. Lady Morven cleared her throat. "Mr. Pendray," she said briskly, "I believe you mentioned needing to file those papers this afternoon." "Indeed, Lady Morven." The solicitor began gathering the documents with the efficient movements of a man who recognized his cue to leave. "And I believe I need a cup of tea," Lady Morven added, rising from her chair. She passed Tamsin on her way to the door and paused. She reached up and gently tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind the young woman's ear. It was a gesture so maternal, so unexpected, that Tamsin's composure nearly broke again. "Welcome home, my dear," Lady Morven said softly. Then she was gone, and the library door clicked shut, and Corwin and Tamsin were alone among the maps and the books and the quiet light of a morning that had changed everything. Neither of them spoke. There was too much to say and not enough language to carry it. They stood on either side of the desk. Her father's life's work spread between them like a bridge, and for the first time in 3 years, Tamsin Lydgate felt the solid ground of her own identity beneath her feet. That afternoon, the notice board in the servants' hall was updated. Mr. Gault's name was removed from the steward's roster. No explanation was given. The household whispered and speculated, but no one knew the truth except the 4 people who had been in the library that morning. And in the far paddock, unaware of courts and documents and the machinery of human justice, a black stallion stood at the fence and watched the slight figure in the gray dress cross the stable yard. She stopped this time. She did not look around to see who was watching. She walked to the fence and placed both hands on his broad, warm neck. He lowered his head and breathed against her shoulder, and she stood there in the pale autumn sunlight and let herself be still. She did not need to be invisible any longer. 4 days after the Duke of Ashenmere declared he would rather lose his title than marry her, He asked for her hand. It did not happen in the library, though that was where their story had found its truth. It did not happen in the drawing room or the dining hall or any of the grand formal spaces that a proposal between a duke and a gentlewoman was supposed to occupy. It happened in the stable yard. The morning was clear, the first truly fine day after a week of autumn rain. The grounds of Ashenmere were washed, gold and copper by the low sun, and the air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of late roses. Tamsin was no longer Nell Pascoe. She was no longer a housemaid. She was Miss Tamsin Lydgate, daughter of Emmerich Lydgate, a woman of property and independent means, whose name had been restored to her by the county court the previous afternoon. Lady Morven had insisted on new clothes appropriate to her station, and Tamsin had acquiesced, though she still wore them with the slightly startled air of a person who had forgotten what comfort felt like. She was standing at Vesper's paddock, her hand resting on the top rail of the fence, when Corwen found her. The stallion stood beside her, his great head hanging over the fence, his muzzle resting in the crook of her elbow. His coat, once dull and matted with neglect, was beginning to regain its old luster under her daily attention. He no longer screamed. He no longer paced. He stood quietly, his warm golden gaze half closed, and breathed. Corwen walked across the yard. He was not wearing his coat. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the forearm, and there was mud on his boots from an early ride across the tenancies. He looked younger without the armor of formality, less like a duke, and more like the man his father had hoped he would become. He stopped beside her at the fence. For a moment they stood in silence, watching the horse, watching the light change across the hills. "The solicitor tells me the settlement will be finalized within the month," he said. "Your father's house in Penford has been recovered. The maps have been authenticated and valued. You will be comfortable." "I have never cared about comfort," she said. "I know." He paused. "You cared about truth. You cared about your father's name. You walked into a house full of strangers and enemies, and you fought for both of those things, with nothing but your wits and your courage and a pair of chapped hands." He turned to face her. "I have never met anyone like you. And—" She looked at him. The guarded, severe, grieving man she had first encountered at that dinner table was still there, but the granite had cracked, and through the cracks she could see the warmth that his aunt had always insisted was there. She could see the man who had broken open a locked room to find her father's legacy. The man who had stood in a library and borne witness to her tears without looking away. The man who had opened a door for her when she had spent 2 years opening doors for others. "4 days ago you said you would rather lose your title than marry me," she said. There was no accusation in her voice, only the quiet precision of a woman stating a fact. "4 days ago I was a fool," he said. "I was speaking of a name on a piece of paper. I was speaking from pride and fear and grief, and I was wrong. I was wrong about everything." He reached across the fence rail and took her hand. Vesper lifted his head and watched them with an expression that, if a horse could be said to have such a thing, was one of deep and patient satisfaction. "I am not asking you because of a promise my father made," Corwen said. "I am not asking you because of duty or obligation or the expectations of society. I am asking you because in 4 days you have dismantled every certainty I possessed, and the only certainty I have left is that I do not want to spend a single day of my life without you in it." He paused. The silence was enormous. The whole estate seemed to hold its breath. The hills, the lake, the old stone house with its library full of maps, and its paddock full of sunlight. "Will you marry me, Tamsin?" She did not answer immediately. She looked at him, at his serious face and his muddy boots, and the hand that held hers with a grip that was firm and warm and slightly unsteady. She looked at Vesper, the great black stallion who had found her in the dark and refused to let her go. She looked at Ashenmere, the house she had entered as a ghost and would leave as its mistress, and then she smiled. It was the first full, unreserved smile she had allowed herself in 3 years, and it transformed her face the way sunlight transforms a landscape. "I have been waiting," she said, "for you to see me." He lifted her hand and pressed it to his lips. It was not a grand gesture. It was not theatrical or performative. It was the gesture of a man who had learned, slowly and painfully, and with the help of a magnificent horse and a woman of uncommon courage, that the strongest bonds are not forged in passion or spectacle, but in the quiet, steady act of truly seeing another person and choosing with full knowledge and open eyes. Vesper nudged his head between them, his muzzle bumping Corwin's shoulder and then Tamsin's, as though to say that this arrangement had been obvious to him from the very beginning, and he was glad the humans had finally caught up. They stood together in the stable yard, the three of them. In the pale gold light of an autumn morning, the great house rose behind them, its windows catching the sun. Somewhere inside, Lady Morven was drinking tea and smiling the smile of a woman who had known how this story would end long before anyone else. Somewhere beyond the hills, a solicitor was filing papers that would restore a dead man's legacy to his living daughter. And somewhere in the quiet heart of a house that had been full of grief and silence for too long, a new story was beginning, not with fanfare, not with spectacle, but with the simple, extraordinary act of two people choosing each other, honestly and without pretense, in the clear light of day.